Strauss could hear the clicking of boots beating against the metal deck from the other side of his cell's door. Guards. 3? No, 4 of them. 4 Varf against one unarmed, beaten, and half-starved Terran. They must be feeling bold today. Or maybe they're just in a hurry. He thought, as the annoyingly loud buzzer sounded and the door flung open. He managed to take a sharp breath and brace his core, just in time for one of the guards to jab him with the business end of an L-stick, designed to pacify whatever passed for cattle in Vorfera. A mixture of heat and numbness spread out from his abdomen, causing him to lose control of his legs and drop to his knees. A quick blow with the butt of the L-stick to the side of his head forced his face to be brutally acquainted with the grated floor of his cell. The largest of the 4 Vorf placed a knee on Strauss's back before clasping magnetic handcuffs on his wrists. "On your feet, Terran," the guard said, yanking on the handcuffs. "Your services are required." The translation from Vorferan to the standard Terran came a few fractions of a second later. "You sure he's a Dr. Mavilev? The only one that could supposedly save her?" one of the other guards said. Mavilev pulled up the Terran's right sleeve to reveal 2 red serpents entwined with each other, tattooed on his forearm. "He's a doctor, all right," he spoke. "I know a Terran medic when I see one. I guess we'll see if he can actually save her." With a grunt, Strauss was up, being dragged along the tight corridors of the ship's brig. The face of a Vorf is delicate with hardly any muscle on it, giving a porcelain-like and almost entirely unmoving visage that's nearly impossible for an outsider to discern emotion just by looking at it. Strauss, however, could tell they were stressed. The glances between them, their breathing. This wasn't an excuse for another beatdown. This was an actual emergency. Turns out he hadn't allowed himself to be captured for nothing. One of the Vorfs switched off his translator, nodding to the rest to follow suit. "I still don't like this," he said, thinking that the Terran couldn't understand their language. "If our medics couldn't help her, why could a Terran do any better?" "I don't like a lot of things, Vijictek," another replied. "Doesn't mean I yap about it. The commissar told us to bring him to her, so we bring him to her." "Yes, but it's the chairman's granddaughter we're talking about here. Are we really going to let a Terran touch her, let alone treat her? Why would a Terran medic know the first thing about helping a Vorf anyway?" Vijictek protested. "All the more reason for you to shut up and do as you're told. Are you going to explain to the chairman's headman how you, a naval officer that barely knows how to give first aid, let his granddaughter die because a Terran, being a good medic, wounded your Vorferan pride?" "It's not that. It really doesn't make sense to," Vijictek said before being cut off. "Enough! If he screws up, it's his head anyway. Now move your feet." In truth, it made perfect sense for a Terran medic to know how to treat a Vorf, Strauss thought. A medic's duties don't stop at helping his allies, after all. They involve extracting information out of the enemy as well. And for that, one would require an intimate knowledge of their biology, their anatomy, what to cut, what to burn, and what to stitch to keep the interviewee breathing, talking, and most importantly, feeling. This wasn't the reason he was the last hope of that young Vorf girl, however. The medical personnel on board would be among the most capable in all of the Vorf Union, given the importance of the ship's passenger. Anything he knew about Vorf biology, they knew too. No, it was his knowledge of Terran biology that made him indispensable. That made his surrender at the hands of the Vorf rescue force necessary, along with the beatings, the starvation, the torture. He had to be there, on that ship with her in case this exact thing happened. If everything else failed, he would be the only one that could save her. His thoughts raced at what could be wrong with her. Infection, allergy, rapid mutation caused by exposure to cosmic rays? If it was this last thing, there would be precious little he himself could do, given how unstable her genome was. This and countless other scenarios went through his head when the alarm started blaring and the emergency red lights came on. "Vorfera is a cold place," Commissar Yevnik said with a barely perceptible smile on his porcelain face. "It warms my heart that I have friends such as you." Irwin was himself very cold indeed, but his single heart wasn't at all warmed by the sly words of a Vorf commissar. He had been playing spy in the halls of the Grand Assembly for far too long to still find any charm in this sort of game. These are the coordinates to the world. I'm not giving you the exact location of the facility. You're going to have to actually look for it. Make the whole thing at least a little bit believable. Most of the facility is deep underground, so you're going to have to use a DC scanner. Like the ones they use for mining surveys. You can get your hands on one of those, right? The question alone was an insult. A member of the commissariat could get his hands on whatever he wanted, except for one thing, the chairman's granddaughter. That's where Irwin came in. Yevnik had been stuck in the position of commissar for the better part of the last 3 decades, and he wasn't getting any younger. His aspirations, however, were as high as they were on the day he was accepted into the People's College of War. He dreamt of climbing through the ranks, earning honors, medals, wealth, and power, until he gained a seat in the Grand Assembly. From there, he could make his vision of the Vorf Union a reality. Break new scientific grounds, forge peace in the galaxy, lead his people to a new age of, well, no, truth was he just wanted more power. Instead, his climb along the political ladder was decidedly halted, jumping from world to world in the Vorf Union, extorting the local leadership for bribes, and hunting down the odd cell of revolutionaries was the height of his power and influence. That all, however, was about to change, because now he had Irwin, and Irwin had his ticket to the Grand Assembly. 8 standard years ago, in the midst of the Second War between the Galactic Federation the Vorf Union was a part of, and the Imperium of Terra, a Terran strike force had raided the frontier world of Jarevnik 6, while the chairman's daughter and his infant granddaughter were visiting as part of the planned propaganda tour. The population that wasn't slaughtered on the spot was kidnapped. Among them, the chairman's beloved relatives that had been missing ever since. And the child? She will be there too? You guarantee it? Yevnik asked, almost salivating at the idea of his triumphant return to Vorfera with her. I guarantee it. This entire situation has left a sour taste in the mouth of the Imperium. You know we have her. We know we have her. And we wish to mend things with the Union. Of course, we can't just admit to all this and hand her over. That's why you will find her in an unofficial facility in the frozen desert of an unclaimed world, in the middle of the void, Irwin replied, though he could see Yevnik had stopped paying attention after the first 3 words. One thing is very important, however, Irwin said, stepping forward, his face shifting from a calm expression he had up to that point to one that commanded attention on an almost instinctual level. Yevnik had always found the ability the Terrans had to shift their faces like that extremely disturbing. Any personnel in the facility that surrenders, you will take alive, especially any medical personnel. They have been tending to your chairman's granddaughter for almost a decade. Any needs she may have, you will defer to them. Am I clear? Perfectly, Yevnik answered, still transfixed to the Terran's gaze in a mixture of fear and respect. What's going on? Vachektek the guard asked, fully knowing his comrades were just as deep in the dark as he was. Wait for the beeps, Myvilev answered. 1 beep is life support system failure. 2 beeps is a hull breach. 3 beeps, hostile on board. The 4 guards and the prisoners stood there, bathed in the hues of the red emergency lighting, waiting. The entire vessel had gone silent. No rumbling from the engines, no creaking from the metal decks. It seemed as if the ship itself held silent, anticipating the signal. Only the sounds of their heartbeats were audible, keeping the pace 1 beat at a time, when suddenly the first sharp shriek of the klaxon sounded, the first beep. A second later came another, and finally, the third. Myvilev pulled his L-stick out of its holster. Medbay, move, he commanded, shoving Strauss forward. The commissar's vessel was a patchwork of different ship parts, each cannibalized from a different void craft and stitched together. The result on the outside was an ugly amalgam of varying bits and pieces, looking every bit as unsafe as it was. On the inside, it was a confusing mess of winding hallways looping in on themselves and resulting in dead ends, more often than not, in a hopeless attempt to connect each part with the other. In those corridors bathed in red and echoing with the same 3 sharp beeps over and over, the group of 5 moved as fast as they could. Pirates? A guard speculated. The DEW batteries can be heard from one end of the ship to the other when they charge. If pirates boarded us, we would have known, Vachektek answered. Maybe they drifted dark, no engines, system power down. They'd be in breaching pod range before we could detect them, the guard argued. We're doing a full burn. Sure, this thing isn't the fastest, but another ship matching our speed while drifting dark? No. Vichektek shut the argument down. Whatever it was that caused that alarm, it came from within the ship. As Vichektek turned around to face the other guard, he felt a warm, wet sensation across his face, before the metallic tinge of its flavor gave away the nature of what he had been splashed with. His comrade guard's blood was all over Vichektek's face. Everyone stood in silence as they observed the guard's decapitated body collapse on the deck, almost as if in slow motion, due to the ship's reduced arc graph. There wasn't any panic, not immediately at least. They were almost hypnotized by the sudden brutality of the whole thing. A comrade dead in seconds, and his killer nowhere to be seen. Strauss was the first to snap out of the trance that had affected the group. He noticed a hole in the paneling in the hallway just big enough for a Terran to crawl through, and into the network of maintenance corridors that crisscrossed the entire vessel. Without a second thought, he jerked himself away from Myvilev's grip and dove in. The sound of the energy bolts from Myvilev's service pistol striking the metal behind him accompanied Strauss. As he ran further inside the ship's twisted intestines, however, he noticed nobody was following him. Instead, he could hear the shock wear off amidst the group of guards, and the realization of what they had just witnessed setting in. Questions of what and how were screamed at each other as if any of them had the answers. Strauss must have wandered for hours in almost complete darkness with the maintenance tunnels that ran parallel to the ship's proper hallways, his only and occasional light source being the sparse beams of that infernal red emergency glare that peeked through the gaps in the panels. When the gap was big enough, he would chance a look outside. The scene that had played out with him and his captors had seemingly been repeating itself across the voidcraft. Viscera, gore, and thick yellow blood covered the halls outside. When the maintenance corridors took him by the escape pods, he could see piles of bodies stacked trying to reach them. He could see the bloodied handprints on the doors they desperately tried to open. Whatever had killed the guard was still out there, carving a path of slaughter through the ship. Still, all of this was immaterial. Strauss still had to get himself to the medbay to try to treat the girl, keep her safe, no matter what. He would have to go outside of the relative safety of the maintenance corridors and find his way to the medbay. There was something familiar in the carnage. He had seen it before, the way the victims of whatever stalked the vessel were killed. Pulled apart almost. The locations of the bite marks on the dead dwarfs' throats, where the carotid artery would have been on a Terran. The creator of this butchery shared the instincts of a Terran. With this thought in mind, Strauss hastened his pace, not even paying attention anymore to the death that surrounded him, the blood that glistened in mesmerizing yellows as the emergency lights bounced off of it, or even the putrid scent of ruptured dwarf intestines. He needed to find the girl, Chimera. He should have remained calmer, paid more attention. He should have heard the second set of footsteps. He should have seen the pair of eyes in the dark, because now the Chimera had found him. Urin wasn't joking when he said the facility was in the middle of a frozen desert. If Vorfera was cold, then this place was freezing. The rescue party, with Yevnek at their head, had trekked for miles in these conditions, through feet of snow and over treacherous ice, until they finally saw the entrance to what looked like a mine shaft sticking out of an endless white. Around that gaping wound in the landscape were a few smaller, prefabricated buildings, military-looking barracks, a guard outpost, a communications array, and a small medical tent meant to treat urgent injuries sustained in the frozen hellscape before directing the patients underground. Any emblems and markings that once were on them had long been scraped off, leaving only their faint outlines still there. Even as just an outline, however, Yevnek could recognize the shape of an imperial aquila. This was the right place. Yevnek and his men went door to door in every building in the above-ground part of the facility, each one as empty as the one before it, all except the medical tent. The smoke coming out in puffs from the generator attached to it was the first clue. The rescue party stacked against the tent's entrance and followed their breach protocol. A quick pull of the heavy cloth that covered the entrance, 2 concussion grenades, and a lot of shouting later, commanding anyone who was inside to get down. And they were in. A single Terran in a white exosuit stood there, his face obscured by the void-black visor of his helmet. He almost didn't look real, completely unfazed by the rescue party's dynamic entrance. In calm, smooth motions, he pulled his hands up in surrender, got on his knees, and waited for the Worf to make a move. Decades of reports from all over the galaxy about the Terran martial prowess and years of actual experience for those in the rescue party that were veterans of the last war between the Galactic Federation and the Imperium of Terra had taught them that the Terran Legionnaire would choose death before surrender. Yet this one was just waiting for them to apprehend him. Something about the whole situation felt unnatural. Yevnek could feel it too. Like staring at a predator that was waiting in ambush, he felt that even the slightest move could cause it to leap forward. His greed and aspirations, however, held a stronger sway over him than his sense of fear and common sense. With a nod, he commanded one of his men to grab the Terran. With apprehensive steps, one of the Worf inched closer to the Terran. As he put him in handcuffs, the Terran turned his abyss-like visor towards the Worf, almost causing him to leap backward. "Central Labs, Sublevel 8, the Terran said, before turning his head towards the ground again and allowing himself to be cuffed. As the rest of the Worf pulled the Terran outside, Yevnek managed to take a closer look at his exosuit. All patches and insignia were stripped away from the suit, except for one, a patch of 2 red serpents entwined with each other. With the Terran medic captive secured, the rescue party ventured into the maw of the shaft that led to the rest of the facility. Their descent into the depths was accompanied only by the weak glow of an overhead light bulb in the incline elevator's gondola and the creaking of gears against the chains that pulled the elevator down. The facility proper gave Yevnek the same feeling of unease all the Terran facilities he had seen the inside of during the war gave him. The Imperium of Terra had somehow managed to build the feeling of oppressiveness into their very architecture. Endless halls of soulless concrete ceilings too tall to be practical, but tall enough to remind you how small and minuscule you were in the face of the Imperium, all stained by the passage of time, the discoloration of the concrete, the hints of disrepair in the flickering lights. It was clear that the facility was built a long time ago, but had only recently stopped being in use. As they made their way deeper and deeper inside, it became clear that the building was once used for advanced weapons research. Large rooms labeled testing grounds, spare parts and old blueprints for military gear. Some of it Yevnek even recognized, as he had been in their receiving end off. All of it was too old to be of any use by now, though. The designs were at least 2 generations too old. The prize was deeper still. Slowly, the facilities became more modern, indicating to the commissar that there was an expansion on them relatively recently. There were still testing ground chambers, however. They didn't bear the markings of conventional arms usage that the older ones did. No kinetic bullet holes, no scorch marks from energy weapons. No, there was something else in these rooms. Nail marks painfully etched at the doors and the concrete walls, dried out spatters of blood, bits and pieces of bone. No sign of what had caused them, though. One chamber, a particularly large one, was labeled dumping grounds. The centerpiece of this hall was an enormous conveyor belt, flanked at both sides by industrial claw cranes. In the distance, the destination of the conveyor belt could be seen. An old furnace. Its fire may have long gone cold, but its hungry maw stood open wide, ready to devour anything and everything into the abyss that hid behind it. The corridor that led further into the facility, closer to Yevnek's promised trophy, ran parallel to the length of the dumping grounds, with glass on one side to make observation of the process easier. Yevnek couldn't help but notice what exactly was being dumped there. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of bones. A mass so big it boggled the mind. Bones covering the entirety of the floor, at least at knee height, with piles near the cranes that stood even taller than that. And those were the remains that the Terrans hadn't gotten around to incinerating yet. Some still with flesh clinging onto them, others fractured beyond recognition. Those that were still somewhat whole could easily be identified as once belonging to Worf. Mixed with them were personal artifacts as well, personal electronics, clothes, shoes, jewelry, children's toys. Yevnek's stomach turned at the sight, at the thought of what sort of devil he had struck a deal with. It was far too late to renege on it now, though. All he could do was keep going, hoping whatever was at the end of that corridor was worth it. The rescue teams made its way to Central Labs. The naming of this part of the facility filled Yevnek's heart with dread, yet he ventured forth all the same. Behind the doors of the Central Labs stood a sea of lab and testing equipment. Test tubes, vials, and machines Yevnek had neither the academic knowledge nor the willingness to comprehend the purpose of. He had seen enough. All he wanted to do was grab the chairman's granddaughter and get out. It was easy enough to spot her. She lay alone in a stasis bed. A young, beautiful girl with delicate features, even by the standards of the wharf. The commissar couldn't help but take note of how calm and peaceful she looked, like she was sleeping in her own bed, unaware of the horrors that stood around her. Her first memory was that of a scent, the scent of blood. She was drawn to it, craved it. The next thing was the face of terror in a man's face. It was blurry and almost dreamlike, like all first visual memories are. But she could remember the feeling it gave her, joy, near exuberance. She would get to experience it again as she grew up. Every time she was sent to the testing grounds, she would revel in the violence, in the sound of screams and of bones breaking. She came to feel naked without dried blood covering her face. She was a weapon of the Chimera Project. A Vorf infant, genetically altered with Terran DNA, to be stronger, faster, more brutal than the rest of her kind could have ever hoped to be. What really set her apart, though, wasn't her muscle fibers, her bone density, or her ability to heal from injuries that would instantly kill any other Vorf. What set her apart was what was inside her brain. Terran instincts. No other species in the known galaxy was ever quite like the Terrans in that regard. No other species had such an ability for violence, for brutality. That natural inclination, enhanced by constant neuro-indoctrination, all wrapped up in the unassuming package of a young Vorf girl, made the perfect time bomb. She could be planted where she would cause the most damage, wait until the time was right, until being triggered to create unmatched carnage. Alas, perfection isn't something that can be found in this universe. The genetic manipulation, the chimeric splicing of the genomes from two different species, created an incredibly volatile organism. The flame that burns twice as bright lasts only half as long, after all. Her years growing up in the Terran facility were marked by her waking up coughing her own blood, being rushed for emergency surgery, being fed from a tube more often than not. All through those years of death and pain, of experiments and surgeries, there was one figure that was a constant, Dr. Strauss. The Terran who, amidst a horde of medical personnel and guards, held the sole responsibility of being there for her, to help her through a night of puking when a new deviation in her genome caused unforeseen complications to her organism, to hold her and calm her down when she spasmed every time the parts of her Vorfaran nervous system tried to eliminate the growing Terran nerve cells, to teach her the aspects of life other than the killing that she was designed to inflict, to treat her like a daughter, to save her no matter what. When she started spasming in the quarters of the commissar's voidcraft, as her nervous system was trying to cannibalize itself once more, every doctor on board was rushed to her aid, until eventually, so was the Terran prisoner that was being held in the brig. As her condition deteriorated, one of the Vorf doctors decided to wake her up from stasis, speculating that perhaps it was the stasis drugs that caused her condition. The spasms didn't stop, but as she regained consciousness, she could somewhat control them, like she had done before, like Strauss had taught her. There was something she couldn't control, though, those instincts of hers, those Terran mental patterns that were implanted within her. They couldn't so easily be hidden. Commissar Yevnek was among the first Vorf on board to see her open eyes. In those eyes he saw something familiar. He saw the same cold menace he saw when he looked at Irwin's eyes, the same abyss stretching behind them. He saw the eyes of a predator, far deadlier and far more dangerous than anything else he had encountered, anything other than a Terran. It didn't take long for realization to set in, for Yevnek to figure out what he had seen at the facility: the piles of bones, the bloodied nail markings on the doors of the testing grounds. In but a single moment, he knew what he had to do. He pulled out his pistol and took aim. Dazed from just being woken up from stasis as she was still fast enough to duck out of the way, fast enough to escape the medbay while blasts of energy scorched the air around her. In her panic, she reverted to what she did best. She let her instincts guide her. A visage of death itself, she stalked the ship, killing and maiming her way through the crew until she saw something familiar, something of home. She saw the Terran, heard him call her name. For the first time since waking up, she felt secure. She ran to Strauss, grabbing him from behind in a hug. She saw his face, bloodied from the beatings he had endured to stay close to her, and he saw hers. He saw her limbs spasming and knelt to her level, holding her until the tremor stopped. For the first moment since she had been awoken, she wasn't in pain, trying to control her own limbs. The moment lasted but a second when a new warning started blaring over the PA system of the vessel. Scuttling imminent! The commissar had enough. His greed, his ambition, he had let them guide them long enough. Now he was putting an end to this horror. Strauss grabbed the girl by her delicate, blood-covered hand and led her to the escape pod bay he had encountered earlier. As he punched in the coordinates to the closest Imperium-controlled planet, he could hear footsteps approaching. Strauss and the girl weren't the only ones who thought to evacuate the vessel. His decision was immediate and final. Operation Chimera 1 has been altered. Subject Lilith 8 is in an escape pod, en route to your system. This is a priority alpha asset. Keep her safe no matter what, Strauss said in the pod's long-range transmitter to the listening posts in the Agmenon system. She grabbed his arm with enough force that would have dismembered a Worf, trying to pull him in the pod with her, but he barely budged a single step. With a smile, he pried her hands off him and closed the door to the pod. As energy rifle blasts filled the air with the scent of ozone around him, Strauss knew his objective had come to an end. From when she was a tiny infant the size of his arm, to now, to this, he had always been the only one who could have saved her. His last thoughts, his last hopes as the crew got closer, and he had to physically hold them off until the pod detached from the ship, and that no one else would need to save her again.